I used to think silence was the most pleasant thing in the world, until I had to listen to it for 14 days straight on the summit of Mount Katahdin. It was 2014. I had been hired as a winter technician at a small weather station in Maine Station 9, located near the North Summit, where people rarely visit. My job was to cover for 2 other employees, recording weather data and checking the sensor system. Usually, people work in pairs. But that year, budget cuts, and they said one person would be enough. I accepted. Partly for the money, partly because I thought I needed the silence. I had just gotten out of a long-term relationship, and I wanted to be away from people for a while. But I didn't know that sometimes silence is the slowest killer. Station 9 wasn't big, a 1-2-meter long, insulated steel house with 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and an equipment shed. Surrounded by snow, so white that the ground and sky were indistinguishable. Everything made its own sound, the wind whistling through the antenna, the hum of the generator, the drip of water in the pipes. I arrived on February 3. The previous shift, an engineer named Howard, was packing up. He was thin, with sunken eyes and a face ashen. When he shook my hand, he whispered, "Don't turn off the porch light at night." I asked why, and he just shrugged. "Leave it on. It's dark here." I didn't ask any more. He left by helicopter, and a few minutes later the sound of the blades faded and disappeared into the mist. I stood on the porch, listening to the wind, and realized from that moment on, I was completely alone. The first 7 days passed normally. I worked, recorded data, sent reports to the center every 12 hours. At night, I read or just listened to the radio. The signal was weak, but sometimes I could hear someone singing at the other station, a faint, off-key song, echoing through the static, as if from a great distance. I liked it. The feeling of someone else being there, even if I couldn't see them, reassured me somewhat. On the 8th day, the wind changed direction. A small snowstorm rolled in. I had to go out and check the sensor on the north tower, about 80 meters from the station. The snow was thick, the wind was strong, visibility was poor. I took a flashlight and walked slowly. When I turned back, I noticed 2 footprints in the snow, one mine, the other running parallel. I stopped and shone my flashlight, but the wind quickly erased all traces. I thought they might be Howard's old tracks or animal tracks. But what bothered me was the direction they had come from. The other tracks had come from the direction of the station, not from the woods. That night, I didn't sleep. I heard a strange noise from the metal roof, clack, 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 regular, in 3s. I went outside to look and saw nothing but snow. The porch light was still on, a weak yellow, reflecting off the cold silver wall. I stood there for a few minutes, then went back in. The next morning, I found the door to the equipment bay open. I was sure it had been locked. Nothing was missing from inside, just a small, round stone lying in the middle of the floor, still wet. I picked it up. It was heavy, cold, its surface smooth as if it had been polished. I put it on the table, thinking I would ask the center. But then I forgot. By the 10th day, I began to hear voices, or at least, I thought so. At first, it was the wind whistling through the crack in the door, mixed with the vibration of the antenna, forming a sound like someone whispering very close. "Stay." Startled, I turned off the radio, but the sound continued for a few seconds before disappearing. I reassured myself, it was just an auditory hallucination. People in isolation are prone to hearing things that are not real. I had read about it in a book. On the 11th day, a huge snowstorm. All communications were cut off. The radio was static. I wrote in my diary, "No signal. Wind 70 miles per hour. Temperature negative 26 degrees Celsius. No response." In the evening, while I was eating, the porch light went out. I went out, and the ice covered everything. It was completely dark. I took out my flashlight and checked. The wiring was fine. The fuse was not blown. I turned it back on. The light did not come on. When I turned my head, the flashlight beam hit the metal wall, and I saw 3 small, clearly printed wet handprints slide down the doorframe into the snow. I don't know why, but I stood there for a long time, not moving, until the light in my hand went cold. I went back in, locked the door, covered myself with a blanket, and tried to sleep. But all night long, I heard light footsteps around the station, slow, steady, and never going far. The next morning, the storm had passed. I went outside and looked around. There was no trace except my own shoe prints. I wanted to believe it was all an illusion, but when I went back inside, the stone on the table was gone. On the 12th day, I decided to leave the station early, even though my shift was not over yet. I sent out a distress signal, but the signal was still weak. I recorded the data, packed up my things. When I opened the closet, I found an identical stone in my spare jacket pocket. I don't know who put it there. That night, the wind calmed down. I turned on the porch light and sat looking out. The yellow light reflected off the snow, creating a single warm circle in the middle of the white sea. I sat like that until late at night, until the radio suddenly turned on. A man's voice crackled from nowhere. "Don't turn off the porch light." I froze. That voice, it was Howard, my replacement. The next morning, the helicopter arrived. The young, blonde pilot said they received a distress call from me at 2 a.m., but I never sent it. As I left, I looked back at the station one last time. The porch light was still on. I thought I saw someone standing in the door, small, hazy in the mist, but I wasn't sure. Maybe it was a reflection, or just a memory in my eyes. 3 months later, I heard that Station 9 was closed. Howard was missing. No one had found him. They said he'd gone to check equipment in a storm and gotten lost. I didn't believe it. I believe he'd left, but a part of him remained, as did a part of me. Because sometimes, at night, in my small apartment, I'd see the porch light flicker on and off on the wall, and for a few seconds, I'd hear the wind carrying a tiny voice. "Stay." I was a long-haul truck driver. For more than a decade, I drove across the United States, from California to Maine, hauling cargo, sleeping in my truck, living on the road. I was used to the night, to loneliness, and to empty gas stations. But that night, on Highway 219, I encountered something I still don't know what to call. Only that after that night, I never stopped on the road alone again. It was the winter of 2015. I was hauling cargo from Pittsburgh to Buffalo, a route that was relatively light. I started late, because I had to change tires at an inspection station. It was almost 11 p.m. when I left. The road was dark. The wind was cold. I turned on the radio, listening to old music mixed with static. Highway 219 was so empty that I couldn't see any headlights other than my own. Only the signs reflected white light as I passed. I remember thinking just a little further, then the next stop, but the next stretch, after 2 a.m., still didn't come. As the fuel gauge neared the red line, I began to worry. The GPS didn't show any stations for the next 30 miles. I slowed down, trying to save fuel. Then, in the middle of the empty hills, I saw an old, peeling sign. "Gas, food, open 24 hours next right." I breathed a sigh of relief and turned right. The side road was narrow, bumpy, and unlit. After nearly a mile, a weak yellow light appeared. An old gas station, rusty tin roof, 2 old-fashioned pumps. The sign hung at an angle, the lights flashing. I pulled in and turned off the engine. The first impression was silence. No insects, no distant engine noise, just the wind. I got out of the car and heard gravel crunching under my feet. There was light inside the station's glass door. As if someone were there, I knocked on the door and called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No one answered. I tried to open it. It was unlocked. The bell above jingled as I entered. The smell of oil, burned plastic, and old cigarettes hung heavy in the air. Inside, the counter was empty. Behind it, a row of refrigerators, some still lit, full of expired soda. I was about to call again when I heard the back door close. I turned, my heart pounding. The back door was in a hidden corner, and I was sure it had been ajar when I entered. I called out, "Excuse me, I need gas. Is anyone here?" No answer. Just the steady hum of the air conditioner. I walked slowly to the counter. On the table was a handwritten receipt. Enter vehicle registration and amount of gas. Put money in the box. Pump yourself. No change. I smiled wryly. They must have let customers serve themselves. I took out my wallet, put $40 in the metal box, and walked out. The pump was old, the paint peeling, the meter mechanical. I inserted the nozzle, pulled the trigger. The meter was spinning. The gas was flowing. The smell was strong. The wind was blowing. The porch light was flickering. When I looked down at the gauge, I saw a silhouette reflected in the car window, standing very close behind me. I turned around, no one. I stopped, looked around. The whole station was empty. Only my truck, the yellow light, and the trees in the distance. I told myself I was tired, and continued pumping. At that moment, from inside the station, the lights in the room turned on and off continuously. 3 times. I was startled. Let go of the trigger. The sound of the pump stopped. Absolute silence. I went to the glass door, looked in. The light was still on, but the cashier was now occupied. A man stood with his back turned, wearing a white shirt, his neck slightly tilted. I could see clearly because the ceiling light reflected on his shoulder. I called, "Excuse me. I paid. Can you check for me?" No response. He stood still, his head tilted even more, as if listening to something. I tapped on the glass. At the same time, the lights in the station went out. The darkness swallowed everything. I backed away, my hands shaking. The wind blew, carrying with it the smell of burning plastic. I opened the car door, climbed in, locked the door. I started the engine. The gas gauge was full, and I was ready to leave. But before I stepped on the gas, I looked in the rearview mirror. The station door opened, and the man stepped out onto the porch. He stood there, head bowed, arms down. I couldn't see his face clearly, only his white shirt reflected. I stepped on the gas hard. The tires crunched on the gravel, skidding a bit before gripping the road. I didn't look back. We drove for about 10 minutes, then the GPS started to pick up again. I looked at the clock, 3:12 a.m. I tried to turn on the radio, but the car screen flashed. Bluetooth connected, unknown device. I didn't use Bluetooth. I turned off the player, but it turned itself back on. A crackle sounded, and then a man's voice, very small, said, "You've filled enough." I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the wet road. The screen went black. I pulled over, my heart pounding. I unplugged the radio, and sat still in the dark. Outside, the wind whistled through the glass. Gusts. When I calmed down, I looked at the fuel gauge. It was almost full. I didn't remember how much I'd filled, because when I took my hand off the gauge, it was only half full. I didn't think anymore. I just drove straight, until I saw the first light of Ashford Town. I stopped at a new gas station, brightly lit, people passing by. I got out, went straight in, asked the cashier, "On this road, the turn right before the hill, there's an old station, right?" She frowned. "Which station?" "There's an open 24 hours sign, a tin roof, 2 old pumps, next to the woods." She was silent for a few seconds, then replied, "No, that station burned down in 2010. I couldn't say anything. I just looked at her, then turned away. I walked around the car, checked the gas tank. The cap was still closed, but when I bent down, there was a long, black trail of smoke on the side of the car, like a hand. I didn't go back that way, but a few weeks later, back in Pittsburgh, I checked the expense receipts for the company. In my wallet, among the receipts, there was an old, wet, yellowed one, a handwritten receipt. Scribbled, "Car 219, $40. Thanks for stopping." I don't know who wrote it, and I never knew where the gas station was. All I know is that whenever I drove on a deserted road, in the middle of the night, I always left the fuel gauge above half a tank. I didn't want to have to stop, not even once. I never went to Lake Superior again. I promised myself that no matter how much someone offered, I would never set foot on that North Shore again. In the fall of 2017, I was hired to inspect an old lakeside house, deep in the woods near Grand Marais, Minnesota. The new owner had bought the land at auction and wanted to renovate it into a small resort. But the main house, the old wooden house right at the water's edge, was uninhabitable. They said it was severely moldy and structurally unstable. I work as a civil engineer, inspecting the condition of the property. That's my job, and I don't believe the rumors. I went alone. The drive was more than 4 hours, much of it through pine forests. It was fall, so the area was a golden yellow in the sunset. When the GPS set arrived, all I could see was a narrow trail covered in leaves. The wooden sign read faded, handwritten, "Lakeview Cabin, Private." I drove in. The road wound for more than a mile, eventually opening into a small clearing, looking straight out onto Lake Superior. The wooden house stood alone, 2 stories, painted silver gray, with an old tin roof and dusty windows. Behind it was the forest. In front was the lake, the water black as lead, the waves gentle, so cold that it gave off a thin steam. I stepped out, hearing the wind howl through the crack in the door. The smell of mold and salt crept into my nose. The front door was unlocked. I pushed it open. Inside was dark and cold, the wooden floor creaking. The late afternoon light shone through the gaps in the curtains, casting a mottled pattern on the walls. It felt like the place had been abandoned for years. I took out my camera, took a few shots, and noted, the wooden walls are rotten. There are signs of water seepage. The second floor may not be safe. The living room had a stone fireplace, with a tilted picture frame hanging above it. I shined the light in, and saw an old photograph, a family of 4, parents and 2 children, in front of this house. I couldn't see the faces, but the light in the photo made me feel creepy. The sky was a hazy white. The lake behind me seemed to be boiling slightly. I went up to the second floor. Thick dust. Rat tracks. But strangely, one of the 3 rooms was still neat. The bed was made. There was an oil lamp and a small notebook on the table. I opened it. The paper was yellowed. The words were scribbled. September 12. The wind blew harder. Last night, I heard tapping on the floor. It went on 3 times, then stopped. No one was there. I stopped. A chill ran down my spine. I turned a few more pages. The porch light turned on by itself. No one came out. The 16th. The lake water rose higher. Someone called my name, far away. The 18th. I don't want to be here anymore. The last page was torn. I looked around. The room was so quiet I could hear the wind coming through the window. I took a few more pictures, then went downstairs. It got dark faster than I thought. When I went out onto the porch, the sun had set. Only a faint pink glow on the horizon. I planned to go back to town for the night and come back tomorrow morning. But when I got to the car, I realized my right front tire was flat. There was no cell phone reception. No cell phone nearby. I sighed, went back into the house, and decided to sleep in the living room. I lit a fire in the stove, ate a quick energy bar. The wind outside sounded like someone was murmuring on a lake. The fire crackled, casting my shadow on the wall. I sat looking at the clock. 9:47 p.m. Then, in the silence, I heard a light tapping from the floor. Knock, knock, knock. 3 beats. Even, I held my breath. It repeated. Slower. I picked up the flashlight and shone it down into the cracks in the floor. Dust, cobwebs, and darkness. No mice. No insects. I tapped it again with my heel. No response. I reassured myself. The wind expands the wood. That's all. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time my eyes drooped, I heard the tapping closer, like right under the sofa. The next morning, the sky was overcast. The lake was calm, covered in fog. I went to the car, patched the tire, and prepared to leave. When I opened the trunk, I found in the toolbox a small, round, smooth stone with 3 parallel lines. I had never owned such a thing before. I threw it into the lake. It sank without making a ripple. I went back into the house to get my forgotten camera. When I entered, I noticed that the fireplace was still warm, though the fire had long since died. On the table beside the chair, the old notebook was open to the same page I had read the night before. But there was a new line, written in a different handwriting. 19th, stranger in the house. I dropped the notebook, my heart pounding. I grabbed the camera and ran to the door. But as I crossed the porch, the outside light came on. Automatically, I stood still, then turned to look inside the door to the second-floor room, gently closed. I didn't stay to check. I got in my car, I started it, and drove straight out of there, the tires grinding on the rocks. I didn't stop until I saw the sign that said Grand Marais, 18 miles. 3 days later, I sent in my report, structure rotten, in danger of collapse, renovation not recommended. I didn't mention the book, or the knocking. A month later, the developer called. They said someone else had come to survey, but they hadn't found a house on that lakeshore. All they found was old cement and a lawn of tall grass. I smiled wryly, thinking they'd gotten the wrong spot. But then I pulled up the photos I'd taken that day. All the frames were clear, except the ones of the second-floor room. The whole place was white, as if heavily illuminated, though I remembered it was dark that day. To this day, whenever it rains and I hear the taps on the pipes, I remember Lake Superior. I remember the silver-gray house, the cold that seeps into my pores, and I remember the last line in the notebook. I don't know who wrote it, but sometimes, in my sleep, I hear the wind on the porch, and a woman's voice whispers right next to my ear. The 20th, you're still here.